Welcome friends, welcome back to the kitchen, welcome back to Sunday morning in the old cookbook show. Today we're going to do a recipe out of this old cookbook, The Art of Cookery, made plain and easy, which far exceeds anything of the kind ever yet published. This was published by a lady. We now know that that lady was Hanna Glasse. My copy is the third edition, printed in London in 1748. And it's a very pivotal cookbook. 1748, published by a woman. Self-published by a woman in 1748. She was able to find patrons. She calls them her subscribers, and she's got a section at the front here where she shouts out to them. These are people that believed in her. These are people that gave her money so that she could complete her dream of publishing this cookbook. It is, though, definitely a cookbook that is, it's crib notes. You have to know how to cook. For most of these recipes, you already have to know how to cook. A lot of it's written in very shorthand. She expects that you already have been trained, you have lived your life in the kitchen, and all you need is some prompts to kind of get you through the recipe, and you're going to do it with your own flair, and you're going to add your own steps, and you're going to add your own things. A lot of them are very vague. Today we're going to do something called a baked bread pudding. There are several bread pudding recipes in this book, and bread pudding is one of those things that I find kind of interesting because anytime I see a bread pudding like this one made on the internet, there's a whole ream of comments saying that that's not a bread pudding. That's not a real bread pudding. Other people talking about bread and butter pudding, which is a separate recipe. A separate recipe that appears in cookbooks in this time period and into the 1800s, becomes more prolific. But we're going to follow this one because I had some breadcrumbs. So let's go. It says, take the crumb of a penny loaf and as much flour. I'm assuming it's by weight because the next ingredient is sugar, and that is weighed. So I've got my crumb, and the same amount of flour goes in, and then the sugar goes in. After the sugar, it's salt and ginger, and I'm supposed to mix that together, or just sort of as much as you can, I suppose. So there we go, that's our dry ingredients, I suppose. Now it asks for 4 yolks and 2 whites. So that's my interpretation of that is 2 whole eggs and 2 egg yolks. So into this jug, I'm going to put 2 whole eggs and 2 whites. So now I'm just going to, it doesn't say to beat them, but I get the feeling that beating them up a little bit would be a good idea. So just using a fork. Now, it doesn't give an amount for milk, which is pretty much standard for this type of recipe in this time period. It just says enough milk to make it like a good batter. So normally you would measure the milk in. You'd probably put it in with the egg, and you'd beat it together, and then you'd put it in. But because I don't know how much milk, I don't want to add the milk to the egg. So we need to add the egg into the dry ingredients now. Mix it in, and then add the milk. And one of the things I find very interesting about this recipe, this time period, 1748, is that for the baked good recipes, their flavorings are quite interesting. It's mostly rose water, which is expected in this time period. There's no vanilla. None of these recipes have vanilla. And the reason for that is vanilla is known. Vanilla is known in Europe from, the 1500s. Explorers come back from Mexico bearing these vanilla pods, and everyone goes crazy for it. But the problem is no one can figure out how to grow it. You can only grow it wild, and you can only grow it wild in Mexico because there's a very specific pollinator that lives in Mexico that pollinates the flowers so that you get the beans or the pods. Even though the French and the Spanish took the vanilla plant all over the world, they planted it everywhere. They thought, oh, we're going to make billions of dollars, in that time period from this plant because everyone's going to love the flavor of vanilla. But they couldn't make it work. They didn't realize that it was missing the pollinator, and they couldn't figure out how to pollinate the plant. Either they didn't know how to pollinate the plant or they didn't know that it needed to be pollinated. until on an island in the Indian Ocean, Ile Bourbon, a young slave boy figures out how to pollinate the flower. That's in 1841, I believe. So this kid on the island figures it out in 1841. Takes a few years to get production going, to disseminate the information, get production going. So as a flavoring, vanilla doesn't start to show up until the 1850s. So it's not in this book at all. It's known, people would know that vanilla existed, but they just couldn't afford it. It was a very small amounts being produced in Mexico, super expensive. Only the highest class people or the richest people would be able to afford it. Last two ingredients are raisins and currants. And currants, of course, in this context, are just another dried raisin. They are the dried raisin of the Corinthian grape or Corinth grape or Zante grape. For some reason, they're called currants, and that's very confusing because people confuse it with the black currant or the red currant, which is a completely different plant family. So we mix those in, and then I'm supposed to put it into a buttered dish and bake it. No temperature, no time, no information beyond bake it. So in it goes into my buttered dish. Get it all in there. Probably could have used a smaller dish. This will be fine. And into the oven.
Hey, Glenn.
Hey, Jules.
Hey, friends. Hurrah, there's raisins. Is that for me?
Raisins and currants.
Oh, and currants. There we go.
Two types of raisins.
Two raisins in one.
Oh, okay. Yep.
Yeah. Oh, I assumed you had a spoon.
So, bread pudding from 1748.
There we go. Double check.
It's in MCMLX1. That drives me nuts. Okay. So, let's see.
I'm just happy there's raisins and currants. Oh.
I like the ginger. Why have I never had ginger in bread pudding before?
These are good questions.
Because I've always had vanilla.
Available.
And vanilla was not an option at this point. So there you go. That's really good. Okay. A little bit dry. There's no milk. It doesn't give a milk amount. It just says until it makes a nice batter. I could have added more milk, but
it's not like...
It's not dry.
Dry.
No. But that opens you up to the opportunity to drizzle a little bit of cream over the top and stick it in the microwave and heat it up.
And there I was thinking you were going to put maple syrup on it.
Maple syrup on it.
Mine's almost gone, so I too really like the ginger. It's not often we give a thumbs up to a really old recipe.
No. So, tell us about your family recipe for bread pudding. Do you still make bread pudding? Did your grandma make bread pudding? It is kind of a stodgy dessert that has fallen out of favor, really. Not a lot of people. I keep a little thing of breadcrumbs on the side. If I have some bread that's going off, I cube it up, dry it out, put it in the container.
And you're ready for any bread pudding emergency.
On Tree Plant, ages ago.
It was a while ago.
When I was checking for, who was I checking for? I think it was Kimberly Clark, or was it Quebec and Ontario? Anyway, I was checking. I wasn't planting. I was checking, and the plant company that I was working for, they made bread pudding, but every day they'd make sandwiches for everybody to take out into the bush. And I asked the cook, "Could you make my sandwiches out of the bread ends?" And then other people started asking for bread end sandwiches because everybody liked the crust. I like the crust.
And then there were
nothing for bread pudding. And everybody got angry because there was no bread pudding, so I had to go back to having regular sandwiches. That's
drama of Glen's life.
Apropos of nothing. Anyway, ginger, no ginger, tell us what you like. Thanks for stopping by. See you again soon.